Oh, so that means I'm supposed to start talking, right? Okay, I guess. Hello everyone, my name is Lucian Vălsan. I don't know which one of you is familiar with anything about what I do. So for those who are not familiar, I am a YouTuber and generally not a particularly nice man. I like to be pretty blunt about stuff. So in the spirit of bluntness, I'm an individual who is firmly on the non-left. And probably the only thing new that I bring to the table is the fact that I'm willing to basically use tactics that conventionally have always been used by the far left against normal people. And I'm the one who comes in and say, hey, we could play that game too. And we should play it against the far left. So that's usually the only thing that I bring new. Otherwise, I guess you could put me into the Milton Friedman camp in terms of economics. And in terms of social politics, I guess I could pretty much get along pretty well with Ben Shapiro most of the time. So that's pretty much about me. Anything else you'll be finding out during the Q&A. I don't want to bore you too much. I want to talk with you rather than at you. So I'd rather spend as little time as possible. So I guess just to set the tone of the conversation, I would probably like to talk today about I'll explain a little bit about the long-term things, and maybe we could get to a certain conclusion on the short-term issues. What I mean by that, of course, is if one or two people learn something new today, that would be awesome. If I learn something new today, is a spectacular success. Yeah, what I mean by the long-term and short-term issues. Today, we are in the situation politically where we either have political forces that are economically on the right, but socially on the far left. So one example of that would be even most of the so-called establishment Democrats in the United States, who are basically neoliberal. They're not libertarians, but definitely they're not communists. They're definitely for a sort of quasi-liberal economy, admittedly a little bit on the crony capitalist side of issues, but still, I mean, we could live with them. But then comes the social nonsense, which makes it barely tolerable, such as the thing that just today I learned that a bunch of Democrat activists are trying to sue a plethora of Christian schools because they ask pupils and their parents to sign a form where they confirm that they're Christians and they're upholding a Christian style of life. Apparently, the Democrats believe that should be illegal in the United States. So there's that issue. Then there's the issue of political forces who are socially on the right, but economically in the toilet. And there are quite a few of such examples. I guess we could put in that bracket Sverige Demokraterna in Sweden, or maybe, yeah, we could put the mainstream Republicans in France, Les Républicains, who are, again, pretty firmly well on social politics, but then on economics they compete with the Leninists, essentially. They compete with Front National and the Socialist Party and En Marche, and all of them are firmly on the left economically, although admittedly En Marche is not left-wing enough, as the protests in France these days are showing to us. The populace is still not happy, but then again, the French have always been socialists, so you can never please them unless you're Mélenchon or something. So yeah, so because of this situation, there is always a split, especially on the people who consider themselves on the non-left. Because if you come out in support of, let's say, Sverige Demokraterna or even Fidesz, then you'll get a lot of curses from the other non-leftists who say, oh yeah, but Sverige Demokraterna, they have an atrocious pension plan, or Fidesz in Hungary has an atrocious economic policy, which is true. And then if you come out in support of, let's say, Emmanuel Macron, whose recent economic policy has been more or less tolerable, definitely to the right of the mainstream of France, then of course you get a lot of flack from your people, essentially, from other non-leftists who say, yeah, but you know, Macron is an open borders guy, and look what he's doing to the social fabric of France. And again, that's true. This kind of separation is not something natural. It has been intentionally over time created by the fact that certain smart individuals amongst our philosophical opponents have appropriated certain themes from the non-left and then left all the others outside of the Overton window. And as a result, everyone on the non-left is now split, and as a result, you never have a proper non-left-wing political force that's winning elections. Admittedly, there has been some progress on that. I would say, for instance, Bolsonaro in Brazil is showing us that you can still have some of that, but then, of course, Bolsonaro has the unfortunate bad luck of being a Brazilian, which means he has to battle with pretty strong opponents. Let's not forget, Brazil is the country where they had the what was it called, the Sao Paulo Forum, built precisely, and that's the word of the founder, the former President Lula said, to build in South America what was lost in Eastern Europe. The forum was built in 1990. They were trying to rebuild communism that fell here. They were trying to rebuild it in South America. So that's the deep state that Jair Bolsonaro is now having to fight. So obviously he has quite a long trip to, and I don't think he will survive that trip. I mean, let's not forget, the guy was stabbed and nearly killed during the election campaign. So there's that. Because this is the case, that needs a new approach. The standard classical conservative approach of let's try to reason with our opponents, let's try to explain to them, here's data, look, capitalism works, the highest amount of people that got out from poverty in human history has happened in the last 25 years as more and more countries in the world have adopted a free market capitalist based kind of system. And we've been trying to explain that to our philosophical opponents, and most of them don't even want to hear. It's a different question on whether they agree or understand what we're saying. Most of them don't even want to hear. And this is particularly true in universities. I'm sure many of you have watched the videos on YouTube and what happens every time a figure of the non-left tries to speak to students, in particular, in the former Western Bloc. And it's increasingly the case here. A pro-life speaker in Poland has had to face Antifa back in 2016. It has gotten slightly better since then, but still, I mean, this kind of disease tends to extend a little bit. Yeah, basically the classical conservative approach has shown limited effects. What hasn't been tried on a big enough scale yet is the approach of going back, basically turning the tables on the left. And that means essentially using on them the methods that they've been using on us. And they've been using on us all sorts of it. They call us racists, even though we're not. They call us sexists, even though we're definitely not. They try to smear. The privilege that we have on the non-left is that we don't have to lie. Because who are the biggest racists in the modern political spectrum? I mean, who genuinely believes that women need a leg up to succeed in society? It's not conservatives who believe that. It's the left that believes that. Same is true with so-called minority rights and so on and so forth. But the non-left has failed so far to use this rhetoric against the left. And that's one aspect that should be done. On the longer term, because that's the portion that is a lot more difficult to explain, is that basically we first have to admit that we lost. The non-left lost almost everything. We lost the schools, almost entirely dominated by the far left. We lost the universities. We lost the churches. We lost the culture a long time ago, especially here in Eastern Europe, which has always been directed, I mean, since the 1948 and until present day, almost any movie that it's done in Eastern Europe and almost every TV show is with a far left message. Almost all of them. Very few exceptions. And especially the ones that get prizes at Cannes and whatever, almost all of them are directed by the far left. And starting from that realization, taking them back is going to take time. Our philosophical opponents have worked between 70 and 120 years, depends on how you count. They've been working on this to achieve the results that they're enjoying right now. Now, of course, we can say, okay, we're conservatives, we're a lot more efficient than our philosophical opponents, and that probably is true, but it's still going to take at the very least 30 years, if not more. And because it's going to take that long, that means we have to keep in mind every time when we try something new, like a new propaganda tool or a new political party or whatever, we tend to get demoralized pretty easy. Case in point, in Slovakia, a few people tried the Libertarian Party, and I told them that, look, you should probably not start with the political party now. You should probably start first with gathering a network and strengthening that particular network, and then maybe 8 or 9 years from now or 10 years from now get the political party. Of course, they didn't want to listen at the time and said, no, we have the party because look, we have 50,000 Facebook likes. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't mean you have 50,000 votes. And even if you did, even if you were to get 50,000 votes, it would still not be enough. And because they got a 0.2 or 0.5%, whatever, they got demoralized. And then the hardest part was me telling them, look, this was only your first participation. Not with the exception of the Communist Party, no political party started with a 35% or a 50% approval rating. All of them started from zero. And, I just have to build up on that. And we also have to understand that not all countries are equal. I mean, a lot of political activists, this is my discussion, my ongoing conversation with a few peeps in Austria, they keep on looking, oh, but look, they managed to do it, how come FPO managed to do it? And I'm like, yeah, but FPO have been working on it for 40 years. Yes, now they're in government, but 40 years. Sverigedemokraterna in Sweden, they've been, since they reformed into what they are now, which is basically a bunch of social democrats that understand open borders is kind of cancer. That's basically what Sverigedemokraterna is in Sweden. They've worked for 25 years and they're still not in government. They're still continuously what is it, marginalized, I guess would be the term, oppressed. So yeah.
Sorry, what is FPO?
FPO is the so-called far-right political party in Austria.
Austria?
Yes, Österreich. So yeah, so in that vein, we need to understand that whatever we're choosing to do, we gotta get engaged into the long game. And in the long game, the objectives are a little bit different. In the long game, you don't look at how many percentage points you got into the last elections, but rather you look into how many people have you convinced to ask themselves questions. How many people have started to say, well, hold on a second, maybe this whole, no borders thing, maybe it's not a particularly fantastic idea. If you manage to get 3 people a year to ask themselves that question, that's already progress. In the long game, people asking questions is what eventually changes minds. And because we start from a very low position, because almost all institutions are controlled by our philosophical opponents, we have to start slow. And that means convincing people to ask themselves questions. In addition to that, and this is probably the hardest selling point, we need to learn subversion. And subversion is a very complicated process. It's the kind of process that for about 40 years was entirely denied. Everyone just insisted that subversion doesn't exist, or it's a conspiracy theory and whatever. Well, then until a few KGB documents got declassified and everyone started learning that, hold on a second, subversion is not only real, but it also works. And our advantage today is that most of the tools of subversion are essentially public knowledge, public information. It's no longer a secret. But sadly, many people on the non-left insist that, oh, using subversion is immoral. And for those kinds of people, I don't know what to say. I'll be getting to the Q&A, 1 hour of Q&A.
Sorry, just could you define subversion?
If you let me,
Sorry.
I will. Yeah, I will define subversion right away. Okay, subversion is the process through which an institution, and that institution can mean anything from a tiny group to a university or a corporation, or that institution becomes a tool of an interest or an idea that was not part of its original intent. One example of subversion is the Communist Party putting priests that are basically loyal to the Communist Party and not to the clergy or to God or to whatever. For instance, in Romania, the Orthodox Patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church in the late 40s was a guy who said Jesus Christ is a Soviet citizen. Now that's a very obvious example of subversion, but most subversion operations are less obvious than that. One of the, if you want, mistakes of the Soviet Union was that some of their subversion operations were so bloody obvious that most people didn't believe them. Most people under communism knew that what they were reading in the press was mostly a lie, or had a very loose relationship with the truth. A much more efficient example of subversion is modern day The New York Times, a former newspaper, or the Pravda on Hudson, as I like to call them. A newspaper that is basically the propaganda mouthpiece for the far left, but most people don't know it. And unlike in the past, when people were reading Pravda and say, okay, this is the propaganda mouthpiece of the Communist Party, most of what we read here is probably nonsense. Today, people pick up the New York Times and they'll say, come on, it's the New York Times, it's a respectable institution, and why would they lie? And as it turns out, the New York Times lies pretty frequently, especially when it is to the advantage of the far left. So that is a successful example of subversion. How did that happen? Well, it happened over time. In the 40s, there were maybe 1 or 2 communists in the newsroom of the New York Times. And by the 1950s, because of a man who was mistaken by his modesty, his name was Senator Joe McCarthy, everyone learned who the communists were. So for a while everyone knew, okay, if it's this author, then it's probably nonsense. If it's any other author, yeah, whatever. But then after that period passed, then nobody asked anymore. And over time, one more university professor, another university professor, another university professor, they started churning out more and more graduates who, some of them didn't even know that they were essentially militants for a social justice ideology or for a communist ideology or far left ideology. They just didn't know. And this is still the case today. I mean, if you there's that guy, what's his name, Bret Stephens, I think, who is the token Republican on the New York Times opinion page, or the knucklehead row, as Andrew Klavan calls it. Yeah, that guy doesn't even know he's a leftist. I mean, he will insist to you that he's a conservative, and why he goes to church. Yeah, he goes to the most far-left church that exists in the United States, and most of his assumptions about life are oppressor-oppressed kind of narrative. He is a leftist. That's the most successful example of subversion that you can think of. Now, we on the non-left, we're not going to have that kind of NPCs anytime soon, or maybe we will, but not before, I don't know, maybe 15 years from now. What we can have, though, is individuals who are not fully invested into ideological militancy, having them to ask just a few questions to themselves. They don't even have to come out publicly. They just have to ask to themselves. And the way you do that is basically by committing to something that nobody likes to do, which is never get out from propaganda mode. For instance, today, while I was waiting Mr. D to come and pick me up and come here, I noticed that there were a few people there talking politics. And I just couldn't resist. I got into the conversation and explained to them a little bit, for instance, about something called Moveonorg, which is a transnational far-left organization funded by the Democratic Party, which happens to fund almost all of the anti-governmental protests that happen in Eastern Europe. They fund some of them here, they fund a lot of them in Romania, a lot of them in Poland. In Poland, they have a huge operation called Akcja Demokracja, and they're all connected with each other, and they're almost literally the same people. They basically have a few diaspora graduates who then come back and say, oh, look, I'm just concerned for my country. Many of them don't even have the citizenship of their home country anyway. This is happening here too. And you know, once I started telling them those things, I mean, one of them was like, no, this sounds weird. Hold on, let me see. And he picked up his phone and Googled it, and I was like, holy shit, this exists. Those two people will be talking about what I just told them, and maybe 6 months from now, if they'll still be curious, they'll start sounding like me. They'll start sounding like, bloody hell, the leftists are really infiltrated everywhere. What should we do about it? And then they'll be asking the question, what should be done about it? It's a very long process. It's basically hearts and minds, one individual at a time. This is not something easy, and this is not something that will guarantee success in 1 year or in 2 years. This is something that goes into at least a 20-year process. So that's basically the long term. I don't think oh yeah, and be jolly while doing it. If you take yourself too seriously, and I've seen several people who take themselves way too seriously, you're gonna go crazy. You have to be jolly about it. Because again, those of us who are not leftists, we tend to have decent lives. We have we have a job. We tend to have families. We tend to have larger families than the left. So in the evolutionary game, we're also slightly ahead of the curve. And if we manage to maintain that kind of jolliness, we'll be fine. I mean, there is no reason, not yet anyway, for us to get into the whole full triggered mode like the social justice warrior activists tend to be, who tend to be upset about everything. And we should not, we should try our best not to slip into that kind of, and I've seen a few people who do, and that's kind of terrible, and we shouldn't. We should just maintain a jolliness about life, because if we don't, well, yeah. On the short term, and this is where probably I'll stop within 1 minute and then you can ask me anything, we need to be realistic. And by realistic, I just mentioned earlier, if you get 0.5% in the elections, that's not a catastrophe. It's just one election. I mean, it's pretty much like in football. You know, in football, if you get defeated 5-0 in a game, you don't dismantle the club. The football club, you know, I mean, there's always going to be the next season. It's the same thing with politics. I mean, even if you get a resounding defeat in one particular election, you don't dismantle the party, and it's just like, okay, fine. Let's see what we did wrong, or let's see what we can do, and we'll try again next year, or 4 years, or 2 years from now. It depends on the political system. And there's also the adjustment to the country in question, because, and here is something a bit more controversial. For instance, in Israel, the non-leftists have concluded, and I believe they're correct, that look, yes, there are many political parties in Israel, but at the end of the day, in the final analysis, the state of Israel is a one-party state. So as a result, most of the non-leftists, they just signed up to the Likud party, and they created their own caucus inside of the party. It's called the Likud Liberals, and by liberals they mean the classical liberals, not what Americans understand by liberals. And they started influencing policy, and it started to work. It took them 4 years until they started influencing enough of the political party's policy, but it started to work. In this country, again, it's probably a very similar situation. It is, of course, there are other political parties outside of Fidesz, and Fidesz, of course, is unpopular with many intellectuals, and for good reason. But at the end of the day, it's still a one-party state. And whether that can be changed or not, it probably can be changed, as long as it stays a democracy, of course. But changing that is going to take 20 years. If one is in a hurry to implement policy in 5 years, then a different strategy has to be approached. And that's up for individuals to decide whether they want to play the long game or the short game. Sadly, too many people want to play the short game, and not enough people want to play the long game. And this has been true in every single country that I've been so far. There are too many people who want paradise now, which is a very left-wing way of thinking. Yeah, we want everything, I know everything that needs to be done, and if we just do this and that, and I'm like, hold on a second, that's revolution you're talking there. Too many people just want paradise now, and I understand why. It is one of the passions of the youth, but someone needs to play the long game too, and I don't know who that one is. One more thing, and then, yeah, the derailment. Everything that I just said, and a lot more that I will be saying, is completely known by our philosophical opponents. They know this very well, and they understand this. As a result, whenever they see someone on the non-left trying to organize and play this game, the first thing that they will do, and they always do this, because, well, again, that's what I do as well. When I see a left-wing party, for instance, I derailed several left-wing movements like this. So they know this too. The first thing they do is they try to send in infiltrators to derail the conversation. Particular examples of derailment are, you know, you send in anti-Semites, for instance. That's one way to derail a non-left-wing movement. Keep them busy with anti-Semitic stuff. And as a result, they're never efficient. Another example is send them, I don't know, keep them busy with the marginal social issues like transgender bathroom, for instance, which is a perfectly marginal and irrelevant topic, but I've seen several non-left-wing groups being busy for months in the end debating internally whether they should support or not the transgender bathrooms issue, and I'm like, why do you even discuss that? No, and that's it. I mean, seriously? These kinds of things do happen, and our philosophical opponents will definitely try this, should you ever attempt to organize along these lines. And of course, if you can do this to them, you should of course try it. For instance, there was a group that wanted to regulate rent in my hometown, and I made sure to send a disabled woman in their group, a very, very fine lady from our group, and she started derailing them with, you know, intersectional rhetoric, like, you know, I'm a marginalized disabled woman, and your policy is oppressive, and it kept them busy for a very, very long time until they eventually dismantled because they were no longer being efficient. So again, this can be done the other way around. But just because it can be done the other way around doesn't mean you shouldn't always be on the guard that they will try to do it too. And that's why I say always keep being jolly, because, you know, this is at the end of the day just like a football league. I mean, yeah, we try to score, they try to score, and it is what it is. I mean, that's why I say never take yourself way too seriously. So yeah, of course I could talk about these things for hours, but I would rather be more interesting. It would be a lot more interesting to hear what you want to say, and I would like to hear your questions. Probably I haven't hit any, not even a third of the things that maybe you're interested in. So the floor is yours. Ask me anything.
Start with the quickie. You mentioned this organization that finances their
Moveon.org. Yes.
Moveon.org.
Yeah.
How do you know this thing, and how do you know all of this information? Because I tried to search for it and no.
Yeah, Moveon.org is an organization started in 1998 with the purpose of defending Bill Clinton in the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Now they failed at the initial task that they set up to do. Obviously, Bill Clinton got impeached, and everyone remembers Bill Clinton as a rapist. But after a while, they were like, okay, fine, but we could do other things. And they founded something called Media Matters for America, which is a think tank that basically polices the press to be as far leftist as possible, and they've been very efficient at that particular task. And recently, about 4 years ago, they decided to expand into Europe. And not just into Europe, they've expanded it in several other, they have a chapter in South Africa, one in Israel, in Colombia. I mean, there are a few other places, Colombia the country, not the university. And the banner under which this is functioning is called Open, not to be confused with the Open Society, which is the organization of Soros György. No, the Open is the online progressive engagement network. And the website, I think it's opennetwork.org or something like that. But the online progressive engagement network, it's easy to find it. How do I know it? Well, it's my job. It is my job to know stuff. I mean, that's why, this is one of the reasons Mr. D and Mr. A invited me here. It's my job to know these things. I've made it my job to be as informed as possible with the inner workings of our philosophical opponents. It's almost a full-time job. I mean, you always have to, I mean, every single day, even when I'm away, I spend 3 hours reading the news using an algorithm that I partly developed myself, and that's how I keep myself informed.
Is there a collection online, something?
That's what I'm working on to do now on my website.
Do you need any help for that?
Yes, I will need help, of course, but yeah, I just migrated my website on a free speech friendly hosting service. This happened yesterday, and basically as of yesterday I'm collecting stuff to put them on a public library, just so it can be there for anyone anywhere in the world who wants support for their arguments. Yeah, and it is going to happen. It is under construction, and yes, I'm receiving submissions from anyone because yeah, it's going to be needed precisely because, you know, I'm not immortal, and it's better to be there for anyone. It is a very difficult task. I mean, I don't expect to be able to have the library entirely functional by the end of this year, but maybe by the end of this year there will be at least 400 entries or 500 entries there, at least to get things started. And it's going to be on multiple categories like, you know, sex and gender, geopolitics, demographics, and it's also sorted by country. But yeah, it is a difficult task. I mean, think about it. I speak fluently about 10 languages and I understand about 18. And that's one of the reasons why I know so many of these things, because a lot of these things, sadly, do not get translated into English. Especially the stuff about Sweden, for instance. If I had not been speaking Swedish, I would have not known almost anything about Sweden. I mean, most people who've never been to Sweden and they don't speak Swedish, they believe Sweden is a socialist paradise, you know, the functional Scandinavian model. Now, those of us who know better know that that's not just a lie, it's an absurd lie. But also, most people don't know that, for instance, Sweden has a literal ministry of propaganda. It's called Svenska Institutet, whose sole job is to make sure what they allow to be translated, and that's the language they allow to be translated into English, and what they don't. At one moment, I was writing for a dissident Swedish newspaper, and that Swedish newspaper doesn't exist anymore. And at one moment, they moved the HQ to Denmark, because in Sweden they were suddenly guilty of hate speech, just because they disagreed with the current government. It wasn't even something particularly hateful. I mean, for instance, one of the prosecutors, I guess, from Stockholm, was really interested in prosecuting me for hate group. What's the name? Hate group, folk group hate something, that's called the charge. Anyway, basically hate speech against a targeted group, because I wrote about a particular gypsy family who basically was getting state subsidies both in Romania and in Sweden. And I wrote an article explaining why and how this is possible, with, you know, sources from the Swedish law and the Romanian law, and said, look, the laws are written poorly in both countries, and these people just simply outright lie in their application forms, and the bureaucrats don't check it because bureaucracies tend to be inefficient. It was one of the most innocent articles that I ever wrote. But by Swedish standards, that was hate speech. Again, that was in 2013. Today it has gotten slightly better. The corridor of opinion has gotten slightly wider, but yeah.
Very happy with this plan.
Yeah, it is not something easy. I mean, that's
my point. So basically I found nothing, zero.
Sorry?
I found nothing about it, so I found zero. When the Soros leaks happened a few years back, and I went through and tried to find something Hungary related, didn't come up with anything.
I haven't combed through all of those leaks, but I've combed through quite a few of them, and I was a bit surprised, for instance, to see how well things were separated by country. And yes, some countries where I knew for sure that Soros had operations in, they just didn't appear there, even though they should have. Why? Because we have to understand that the open society is one of the very well built operations, agitation and propaganda operations. The chapters of the open society very rarely communicate with each other. The secret there, which is not really a secret, it's public information, is the way they recruit people. They recruit a certain type of personality. And as a result, they ensure a pretty uniform outcome, even without them coordinating with each other. That's why whenever you have leaks, it never reveals too much about the overall agenda, because there is no overall agenda that can be easily described. With that said, one of the reasons I stay away from the Soros-related topics is because the topic has been made toxic. And it has been made toxic, you know, if I were to be a conspiracy-minded person, and I'm not, I would say that Soros basically paid stupid shills to make it toxic. Now, of course, I don't think that happens. That happened. It's just that these kinds of things need a certain level of, a certain level of intelligence to assess. And sadly, the the political forces that have tried to gouge this, they haven't been particularly good at it. And I'm sure this is the case here too. It's definitely the case in Romania, where a lot of basically idiots started speaking in public about, oh, Soros does this, and Soros does that, and I'm like, half of that is entirely wrong and the other half is poorly explained and you're all insane and you're ruining the topic, and basically made it very hard for anyone serious to go out in public and say, look, there is such thing as Soros subversion, but it happens on this narrow aspect and not everything. So yeah, that's why I stay away from these kinds of topics. But if you're curious about more of that, I will gladly.
No. I'm curious about what is actually going on.
Be more specific, because otherwise we'll stay here until tomorrow morning.
I'm waiting for your website to go on. So
Okay,
this
yeah.
topic is actually
Freedomalternative.com, it is the website.
Freedom and?
Freedomalternative.com. For now it's only a few announcements, and I think I've introduced like 2 or 3 library elements in it, but it's going to be pretty spectacular. But it takes time, probably because I'm busy being in every country I can. I mean, just
wasting your time here.
I'm wasting my time here. Yeah, probably. But then again, I like wasting my time in Budapest. It's a nice city. Again, I don't claim to know everything. I probably know less than 5% of the whole thing, because nobody can know everything. But it seemed to me, and this was a decision that I made about 8 years ago, well, 9 now, in 2010. I was like, look, I'll have to do it myself, because if you don't dedicate time to it, there's probably no way to advance in this kind of thought. And I still do have clients. I still work as a freelancer in information technology. And this is basically my hobby, because I don't live off of. It's very hard to live off of your intellectual thought. I mean, it's a privilege for a very tiny minority of intellectuals, and not always good intellectuals, mind you. I mean, I was mentioning earlier Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj Žižek is very well known on the left. Even he doesn't live off his work. He has some passive income.
He's a capitalist.
Yes. Don't tell me you're surprised. I mean, every single socialist is a socialist until it comes to his own wallet, and then suddenly they all turn into William F. Buckley, and they all start realizing. I mean, you should look up on YouTube. I hope nobody censored it. There is a clip with Will Smith, who was at the time advocating for higher taxes in America, and he was in the TV studio of Frans van Kaater. Frans van Kaater, the English language studio, and he was there explaining that he would prefer to be taxed more, because he's wealthy, and the wealthy people should be taxed more. And the lady that was moderating the talk show was like, well, why don't you move here in France? I mean, here in France, the taxes on people like you is 75 to 80%. And Will Smith was like, 80%? Are you fucking kidding me? No, come on, no, it can't be that big. It's like, yes, 80%. I mean, if you really think that you should be taxed more, why don't you move to France? We could definitely use some of your wealth to pay for our social programs here. And suddenly Will Smith was sounding basically like William F. Buckley. Was like, come on, 80%, that's theft, that's horrible, I mean, come on. And yeah, this is true with many socialists, not all of them, admittedly, but most people who profess to be socialists in public, when you start asking them to live up to their own book of rules, they suddenly realize that's probably not a good idea. This is again a leftist tactic. Make your enemy live up to his own book of rules. This is part of turning the tables on them. If you see someone advocating higher taxes, well, ask them to donate to the government more from their wealth. And of course all of them will say, oh, come on, no. It was tried in Norway, by the way. In Norway now the government is still a coalition between the mainstream right and the far right. To understand the context, in Norway the far right is called the Progress Party. Because they have to progress from a fully centralized economy to a capitalist economy. So as a result, the Thatcherite party is called Fremskrittspartiet, the Progress Party. And the Progress Party, as part of the government coalition, came up with the idea, hold on a second, let's have an account with the National Treasury for donations. And everyone who believes that taxes are not high enough in Norway are invited to donate into this account even more, to the extent that they believe the taxation level should be. In 1 year they raised 2,000 euros, which is basically zero. I mean, so
Well, that's not quite fair, because what they're saying is not that they want to pay more, it's that other people should.
Well, in fairness, the socialists in Norway, they say that they should pay more. So, the government
So what's stopping?
Good question. Obviously, every single advocate of higher taxes just disappeared disappeared from the public view in Norway for the next 6 months. Once the government said, "Oh, where are you people? Here's the account. Give shekel," and of course nobody gave. I mean, 2,000 euros. That's pocket change.
So I think they say that I would pay more if everyone else paid more. So it's not quite the same.
Yeah, sure. But then again, I will defer to the wisdom of the president of the Progress Party and say, lead by example, comrade. I mean, at least in the 50s and 60s, many socialists, both in the East and in the West, but especially in the West, they would at least attempt, almost always fail, but they would at least attempt to lead by example. This is true even today. For instance, in Uruguay, the president goes to the public hospital. He never goes to private hospital. He always travels without a bodyguard, and he tries to lead by example. So as a result, it's a lot harder for his opponents to say, look, this guy is a moron, because his economic policy sucks, but at the same time he does live up to his own book of rules, at least for a while. So as a result, he's pretty popular. But most socialists today, they don't try to live up to their own book of rules, and that's why they should be put to task, to at least try. Because again, in these kinds of debates, you don't have to convince the opponent, the socialist, that he's wrong, because that's very unlikely to happen. Especially with hardline ideologues, there's just no point. But if there is an audience to that particular dispute, the point is to convince the audience that your interlocutor is an idiot. If there is no audience, there should be no discussion. For instance, I don't have private chats with militant socialists. Never. Why? He's not going to change my mind. I'm not going to change his mind. Why waste the time? But a public debate, sure, let's have it, because the point is to convince the audience. Same thing here. I've seen people that are like, oh, we're going to go. When a few years ago there was a protest held by some feminists here in Budapest, and a friend of mine, who I won't mention his name with the cameras open, I'll tell you after I shut down the cameras. He was like, oh, I want to go there and challenge them, and I was like, why? I was like, well, because it's going to be fun. Okay, that's fair argument, but you're not going to convince them, and you don't have an audience. I mean, it's 10 feminists protesting, and you and 2 of your friends challenging them. What's the point? If there is no audience, there's no point. Yes, if you're coming with the national media with you, and the whole encounter is recorded and then broadcasted, yes, go and challenge them. But otherwise, no. Same thing that I do whenever there are protests in Romania. If I can have the camera with me and an operator with me, yes, I go and challenge the protesters, because then I get to publish it on YouTube, and other people are like, Jesus Christ, the protesters are really dumb. But if there is no camera and no audience, no, why would I do that? Recently, for instance, I undermined a little bit the career of a politician who became an MP through a progressive-leaning party, but now he tried actually to profess as a conservative. And we went to an event where he was supposed to speak, and he spoke, and after the event we're like, can we have you for an interview, sir? Sure. And I asked him something about the event, whatever, and then I asked him how does it fit to be a conservative, while at the same time he's a fan of a very, very far left type of law, which essentially aims to regulate the amount of noise in your house. And I like, these two things are kind of incompatible. I mean, you can't be for individual freedom while at the same time telling me that, the law itself was really insane. I mean, the limit was 30 decibels, which basically means library quiet. Anything louder than that would have been illegal under his policy. So it's not it was the kind of really insane type of policy. And the guy got stuck because he had no answer to that. And when I published that video on YouTube, obviously there were a lot of people who were like, hold on a second, this guy is really weird. And I even got to convince a lot of leftists that maybe that kind of legislation is not a good idea. And the main success of that, it's a video like 3 minutes long, but the main success there was to get a lot of people to ask themselves, hold on a second, if the state can regulate how much noise I can make in my house in the middle of nowhere, what else can the state regulate? And why should the state have so much power? And all of those people who are asking those questions, they'll probably arrive to their own answers 6 months from now, 1 year from now. And 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, or 6 years from now, when I'll probably meet them again to pitch them a non-leftist political party, then we'll be speaking the same language. Because that's the thing, our philosophical opponents have managed, and this has happened here too, have been able to subvert our basic assumptions. How many people in Hungary, for instance, assume that the government shouldn't have a particular power? Very few of them. I mean, most people assume that the government can do pretty much anything, provided that it is decided democratically. Well, that's not a natural state of affairs. That is the result of decades and decades of far-left subversion of people's basic assumptions. And changing that is going to take several decades. And it starts with these kinds of small conversations with one individual at a time. Tell them, why should... and this time is easy because since the government is run by Viktor Orban, who is quite unpopular with a significant portion of the population, you can just start flat out asking, why should Orban decide how loud are you allowed to speak in your house? Do you trust Orban more than yourself? Because that's how you get people to ask themselves questions. You can see that being used by, what's it called, the Young American Foundation? No, not the Young... what's the name of the organization of Candace Owens? Turning Point USA. Turning Point USA goes routinely into black neighborhoods, and as I'm sure many of you know, most blacks vote Democratic. And that lady, Candace Owens, goes into the deepest Democratic areas and asks the deep blue Democratic voters, do you trust Trump more than you trust yourself on how to spend your money? And they obviously say no. Well, then why do you vote for increasing the power of the federal government? I mean, and that's how they start the conversation. And again, it doesn't work in one conversation or 2 conversations or 10 conversations. But if you ask these kinds of very hard questions to the philosophical opponents, the voters, not the ideologues again, eventually, most of them, after a while, they start asking themselves these questions, and they slowly start working under different assumptions. That doesn't mean they'll necessarily agree with you, but it does mean that they will start from different assumptions. And at this point, with many, this is especially true in Europe, more so than in the United States, any other type of assumptions would be a step forward than the status quo. Because most people in Europe, East and West, they just simply assume government power as something natural and normal, when it really isn't.
I have a question. You mentioned that not starting with a political party, but to set up an organization, a network of people. And what kind of activities can you build this network around? So maybe you should do charity work or you know, meetings like this.
It can be anything.
Can you tell us some success stories, maybe what other people did and tried and was successful to build this organization?
I mentioned earlier the example Turning Point USA, which was basically founded as a student group in several universities that had no non-leftist clubs. All of them were, you know, LGBTQ activism, pro-abortion, and all sorts of stuff like that. But nothing conservative, nothing non-leftist. And this guy, an evangelical Christian, if you can believe it, these people usually are not into that kind of activism, but he's younger and obviously influenced by the culture around him more than the evangelical church. Charlie Kirk decided, well, I can play that game too. And his intention was to have, you know, 10 friends with whom they can discuss about the insanity of the left. That was his intention. But the group in 3 years ended up having 500,000 members USA-wide because a few posts of his became viral for some reason, and that's how it became a very, very big influential organization. And they are probably responsible for at least 2 percentage points in students voting for Donald Trump. Which is not bad at all, considering that university students don't really vote Republican to begin with in the United States. It can be other things. For instance, in Czechia, the group that has worked a lot, I forget their name. I'll look it up and I'll tell it to you. one of the groups that worked hard to get the gun laws to become more liberal in the classical sense in Czechia. They started as a ski club. And at some point they wanted to go hunting, and hold on a second, we don't have a license for the gun, and maybe there shouldn't be a need for a license for the gun, and that's how slowly they became a gun lobby group. Same thing in Israel. The gun lobby, the Israeli Association for the Advancement of Gun Culture, started as I think it was a poker club or something like that, and it became a gun lobby group.
Yeah, so this is the second part of my question, is that just a little context. So in Hungary there are really Fidesz leaning, like not far right, but really right guys who have podcasts and online presence, and they are really hated by the mainstream, right? Because they are Fidesz people. And I saw one of their podcasts when they were talking with guys who were advocates of male divorce rights, right? So in Hungary you have to separate the children from one of the parents. You have to do it.
I know. I read Férfi Hang.
Yeah, I'm talking about Férfi Hang, and they had them on the podcast, and I found this issue very, very appealing, right? And I was surprised that it's a shame that we don't have a platform, libertarians, to put Férfi Hang on, but the right has. So what I was thinking about is pick one of these.
I don't think it's a shame. In fact, I think it's progress. In most countries, non-feminists don't even find a place on the right.
True. But
so in that regard, it's even better here.
Yeah, I agree. But what would be really good if we could have a platform and put them on. So what I just want to say is that maybe if we could find a very appealing issue, which would be really good to talk about and build our arguments around that, and find a starting argument, and from that grow out. Maybe we could start small and then we could branch out. And the examples that you said are very similar sounding to me.
No, similar and not really. From a propaganda perspective, again, I fully empathize with the anti-feminist argument. Heck, I used to write for A Voice for Men. I'm still part of voiceformen.com, the big organization. I'm still part of their board of directors. So no, I totally empathize with it. But from a propaganda perspective, from an agitprop perspective, you don't start with that.
Okay.
And the reason you don't start with that is pretty simple. Nobody gives a shit about men. It's just the way it is. Sure, it's terrible that things are the way they are, and maybe it should get better, and maybe it could get better. I don't know. What I do know is that at least in the last 3,000 years, maybe it was different before that, but at least in the last 3,000 years, this has always been the case. When an issue was affecting mainly men, nobody gave a shit. Society started giving a shit when it started affecting women. It is the way it is. It's probably part of it is part of nature. Probably part of it is educated. But whatever the reason may be, most people don't give a shit about men. So as a result, you don't start with that, because it makes you universally unpopular, at least at first. Yes, you can add it once you're already popular. For instance, I could give it the biggest example, Donald Trump. Donald Trump used anti-feminist rhetoric when he was already at 45% approval. And yes, he got elected and won, and then he started promoting militant anti-feminists. I mean, Betsy DeVos is a militant anti-feminist, and I'm thrilled of what she's doing with the Department of Education and seriously draining the deep state that's been infiltrated in all universities in the United States. That's great. But he started doing that months after he didn't start with it.
And what could be the good starting points? What are, like sparks as topics?
Usually what I say is economics, but in Hungary is not. In Hungary, probably not. And the reason I say this is because people here don't seem to be liking capitalism that much. And because this is the situation, it's clear that starting with economics is probably not the best idea. And the whole nationalist front is already occupied mostly by Fidesz and has been abandoned by where was those guys that... Jobbik, yes. Yeah, Jobbik, that used to be Nazis and now they're no longer Nazis, but they're... Anyway, so yeah, so once you're out with you.
Stop being.
Well, that's what they say. I mean, you know, I don't think they did, but you know, you get the point. The thing is that if you're not, if you can't do economics, and I don't think you can, and the Nationalist Front is out, then you have to go with something that is that has the potential to become very popular. I don't know. For instance, in Romania right now, me and several people in my network were trying to use football galleries to broadcast. Football hooligans, I guess, to broadcast political message. It has been tried successfully in Poland, and I'm trying basically to replicate the success that they had in Poland and trying to replicate it in Romania. I don't know if the Budapest hooligans are particularly keen on that. I don't know. You'll have to speak with them, or the people who support Ferencvárosi or whatever. I don't know if they're keen on that, but it has to be something that is already popular. Football is usually popular, so you could try there. Other alternatives, I don't know. You could use, if you could convince, you could use the popularity of Judith Polgar. I'm surprised that nobody tried to use Judith Polgar politically so far. I'm really surprised. Maybe she doesn't want to. That used to be my assumption, but nowadays I'm no longer sure. Maybe nobody even tried. But yeah, you have to try something that can tickle the nationalist ego a little bit and has the potential to be popular. Football usually fits both of these criteria. Usually I say try economics, but as I said, Hungarians don't seem to like economics that much. Particularly capitalist economics. I don't know why. I was having a chat with Mr. D last night about why, and he gave me a few reasons that seemed pretty reasonable to me, but still, changing that is going to take a while. But then again, you shouldn't abandon that, because economics is really important, because you cannot do politics if you're poor. I mean, again, everything that we're talking here is a privilege of the rich. For instance, there is no, just 3 weeks from now, I'm going to Zimbabwe. Let me tell you something, there is no cultural Marxism in Zimbabwe. Because both the left and the right are busy about addressing economic issues. Because when you're poor, you don't have the time to wonder what happens with the inner feelings and the oppression of the transgenders. No one gives a shit. Because everyone has to eat first. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the economics of this country has been going slowly downwards, consistently. And it's pretty bad. And that is going to be quite a challenge, because the populace doesn't seem to be liking a capitalist message, but capitalism is exactly what they need for this country to bounce back to economic growth. And I don't know how can that be done.
It's double speak. At the moment, they talk anti-capitalism, Fidesz, but they actually implement.
I've seen that they've lowered a few taxes, which is a good start. Far from.
For the auto companies that come in.
No, even for the regular consumers. I mean, the hosting of my website is in a data center here in Budapest, and I've noticed that it has gotten cheaper because the VAT got lowered.
VAT is 27%.
No, it's no longer 27%.
It's no longer for everyone. It's not for every service.
It's not uniform.
I see. So it's only an exception for IT or something.
For most things, it's 27.
For a couple of years, you know.
This happened, I think, after the protests against
until November
the internet tax.
2018.
They wanted to tax it, and they ended up
Reducing.
Until November 2018, I was paying 27% VAT on the services for the Hungarian data center. And since December, so now 2 months in a row, soon to be 3 months, I've been paying only 19. So I'm telling you, on IT, definitely the VAT got lowered, because you know I really keep track on what shekels I spend for my operations.
Yeah, but most VAT is 20.
It's still 27. That's terrible to hear, because 27 is it's the highest in Europe, isn't it? In the world.
Second in the world.
Who has it higher?
It's a Wikipedia page.
The problem is that the compliance was probably the lowest in the world.
I'm not surprised.
Now they are using all these techniques.
I'm not surprised at all that compliance is low. This is the standard. I mean, what's that lady? Alexandria Occasional Cortex. She touts a lot the marginal tax rates of the 50s. Oh, we used to have 90% tax rate in the United States, and it was the most prosperous growth period in the history of the country. Yes and no. Because like 2 people paid that tax. Literally 2, not 200, not 2,000, 2 people paid that tax rate once. That's it. Everyone was using tax avoidance schemes, and there was no compliance with the 90% marginal tax rate. Well, the higher the tax rate, the higher the lack of compliance, for sure. This is one of the nice things for us who advocate small taxes. This is one of the features of a small state. Look, if the taxes are 16 or 15 or 10%, it's not worth to be engaged in tax avoidance and tax evasion schemes. It's more expensive to try to avoid them than to pay them fair and square.
To be honest, I think that for Hungarians, the issue that would be popular could be taxes. I think that we could.
That's popular with it.
Yeah, Hungarians like to avoid taxes.
And yeah.
Aren't we all?
No, but it's not just they like to. If like majority would comply, the country would stop the next day.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, with these taxes, everything would stop the next day.
I'm sure that's the case, yes. Now that I think about it, try the bureaucracy angle.
Yeah.
The level of bureaucracy in this country is really astonishing. And again, I come from Romania, which is a very bureaucratic country anyway, but Hungary is a lot more bureaucratic. I was explaining to him last night, and maybe I should tell you this story too, although it's for a while, for about 12 years, I didn't come to Hungary at all. And then in 2014, an opportunity arose, and it was a shady opportunity. I had no idea whether I will actually make money out of that. But I was like, well, it's been a while since I haven't been to Hungary, and Budapest is nice. It was still warm outside. It was early September. I was like, okay, fine, I'll go anyway. And at that time, it was still a bit expensive to call using the roaming. The roaming surcharges were still high. And I was like, okay, what the hell? I'll do what I do in every country that I go. I'll just buy a local number. So I went to Vodafone, and I wanted to buy a prepaid phone number, which I did, eventually. They asked for my ID, and I'm like, okay, this is weird. Why do you ask for my I don't want a subscription. I want a prepaid phone number. Yeah, but we need your ID. Okay, fine. I'll give you my ID. And then they start writing and writing and writing and writing. 20 minutes later, still writing. 30 minutes later, okay, now we can print. And they start printing and printing and printing. I swear to God, they gave me a huge pile of papers to sign. At that moment, in early September 2014, I signed more papers than I had signed in my entire life until that moment. Obviously, I let that one expire, and I didn't buy any other one. I was like, okay, I'll pay the surcharges. Yeah. So bureaucracy, an anti-bureaucracy kind of rhetoric might be popular. Because this is one of the few consistent factors. Even in Germany, anti-bureaucracy rhetoric is popular, considering that Germans are very, very obedient as people. And it rarely, if you go with an anti-state rhetoric like FDP goes, the chances of success are pretty low. That's why FDP is usually outside of the Bundestag. But the anti-bureaucracy rhetoric is one of the few things that actually works, even with Germans. And I presume it will work here too.
Yeah. So you can say your taxes are high because the bureaucracy is.
Yeah, someone has to feed. Yeah. Someone has to feed the bureaucrats.
Not just that, they stop you from working.
Yeah, that's another problem. Yes, an American friend of mine was telling me that, look, even if the taxes were 60%, I would still be willing to pay them, if provided that there would be no bureaucracy and no regulations. Give me an easy regulatory framework and I'll give you 60%, just leave me the fuck alone. And of course, that never happens. Usually, whenever you have high taxes, you also have high bureaucracy, sadly. So yeah, an anti-bureaucracy rhetoric could work. It's worth a shot anyway.
I would add that they are also kind of right in getting investment from Western Europe. And I'm not talking about the EU funds, but to create an atmosphere for the manufacturing companies. And you are right, no one dares to say that they are actually good at this something.
Now that you mentioned investment, I remembered something else. You can get some intellectual leftists to at least hear your arguments if, for instance, you criticize Fidesz on geopolitics. Because many, admittedly not all, there is such thing as Duginist leftists. Syriza in Greece is one example, Podemos in Spain is another example. But many political forces that are firmly on the left, they're not on the left when it comes to geopolitics. They're pretty pro-Western, pretty pro-NATO, and you can get those people to listen to your arguments once you start saying, look, Fidesz is wrong to court the Communist Party of China, they're wrong to court Putin and whatnot, but listen to me here, we need lower taxes and whatnot. You're not going to convince them all, but at least you'll get them to ask themselves questions. Because one of the things that has happened lately is that most of us on the non-left have been entirely demonized. And there are many people who definitely would qualify as left-leaning, but who now are convinced that people on the right are basically fucking monsters. Yeah. And one way to dispel that myth is to use these kinds of things. That look, we all want to live better. Yes, we disagree on the way to get there. And look, we tried your way, and you know, most of the economic policy of Fidesz was basically a left-wing one until very recently, and it just doesn't work. And yes, you're right to criticize for this, for that, but hear me out a little bit. And but again, this tactic only works with intellectuals, because let's face it, again, geopolitics is the concern of the rather intellectual type of people. And the way we know this is because everyone else, whenever they try to speak geopolitics, the extent to which they know geopolitics is basically, oh, you're a conservative, that means you're a Putinist. To which I always say, your mother is a Putinist. Because case in point, just a few weeks ago, Politico.eu published an editorial explaining to us how Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in Poland is basically a bunch of Putinists. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, you know, the political party of the brother of the guy who basically died in an accident, a plane accident that is still considered to be Putin's fault, they are a political party of Putinists. You must be insane. And most of the editorialists at Politico.eu, they're not necessarily insane, but they're definitely illiterate on most of these topics. So that's why I'm saying the geopolitical argument works, but you have to be careful with whom you're making it. Because many people, they say they are good in geopolitics, but then not really.
By the way, what do you think of Brexit?
I hope it will happen. It's still unclear whether it will happen.
Everything is unclear about it.
Yeah, well, as with everything, the EU. You know, a few days after the Brexit vote, I was invited in London to speak at a conference. And at that time, I met a few anti-Brexit protesters, just, again, a week after the vote or something like that. And they were firmly convinced that because of Brexit, they could no longer eat at a certain restaurant chain, which was a South African restaurant chain. and another protester told me that he's now he has to take an extra day off from work to get a visa for Norway because of Brexit he will no longer be able to travel to Norway without a visa. And I'm like, you do know that Norway has never been in the EU, right? I mean, they never have a Nor-exit vote. Is because they had two referenda which confirmed that they don't want to be part of the EU. So yeah, I hope it does happen. I don't know if it will. If I were to have my own way, yeah, no deal Brexit, fuck off. And the reason I hope
no
it...
deal, no problem. No deal, no problem.
Well, there's problems no matter what happens. But I believe the United Kingdom is strong enough to handle them. I wouldn't advocate a no-deal Polexit, for instance. Because that's a lot harder. Poland has just become an AA plus economy. It's still fragile. So you know, it's a different case for different people.
I'm absolutely fascinated by how vehemently, extremely strongly anti-Brexit Hungarians are.
Why?
I have no idea. Probably because they don't want Hungary to exit. And they are afraid that if Hungarians see a successful Brexit, then Hungary will exit. But
basically, there's just a blind belief in the European Union. Like,
People think that there's a large number of people who actually work in the UK and they can do that because they're EU nationals. So I think that plays a role.
Yeah.
So there's a significant, and it's not just those people, it's
Oh,
also
that's true.
remittances from them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
That's
what
true.
Laszlo says is also true. So there's a sentiment in Hungary
Yeah.
that the EU will save us from all
It's
that.
the good school teacher. Like, so if the
Literally.
Hungarian politicians do something bad, the school teacher will come and just slap them around, and it will be alright.
Last time,
There's
last
just
time-
one problem, that's not how things work.
Of course, but they just imagine it like this beneficial old guy who is just smart.
And also there is this popular idea that without the EU we basically would collapse economically
Yeah.
completely, and, you know.
So I can.
It seems that you're doing a good job
at that. Anyway.
On a more serious note, this kind of sentiment, I don't have an entirely functional formula to how to counteract it. But I'm experimenting on it because I've been able to lower some of it. This used to be the case in Romania too. In the last 5 years, it has toned down quite a lot. And I'm not going to say it's entirely because of me. There are many other people who are trying as well. But what I've seen to be working is to use recent history. For instance, one absolute fact, the European Union, as we know it today, is younger than the post-communist Hungarian democracy. Because the European Union, with the current flag, the current anthem, and the current way of functioning, dates from 1993 with the Maastricht Treaty. The Hungarian democracy dates from 1989. So in any event, the Hungarian democracy passed the test of time slightly better than the EU so far. I'm just saying. So, and this fact is very useful when you tell people, look, why do you put so much blind faith in something that is basically founded yesterday? I mean, we don't know if it can work 50 years, let alone 100. I don't think it's going to work 50 years either. But the thing is that this proved to be, in my experience, very useful in undermining the blind faith in the EU. Because again, this is a relatively new construct. And of course, there is also the overriding fact that there used to be life before the EU, and there's going to be life after the EU inevitably collapses, and it's fine. I mean, geopolitical entities get built, they get collapsed, and others come to replace them, and such is life. I mean, it's not a big tragedy. Putting these things into this kind of worldly context tends to undermine people's blind faith into it. And I believe that should be done whether you're an Eurosceptic or not. For instance, I'm not a Eurosceptic because Eurosceptic means you're still unsure. I'm pretty sure that the EU is cancer. But on a more serious note, it should be done anyway for the simple reason that it is not healthy for anyone to have a blind faith into a geopolitical entity, no matter what that geopolitical entity is, whether it's the United States or NATO or the EU or Russia or whatever. It's not healthy. And especially not healthy with a geopolitical entity so fragile and so incoherent as the European Union is. It's not healthy, and it's for the betterment of our fellow countrymen, if you want. For them at the very least to tone down probably all of them will still be believers in the EU. But if you can manage to undermine a little bit of that blind faith, that's usually healthy, because people should question the things that they believe in. Well, hell, I question free markets and capitalism every single day, and I'm an advocate for it. But I'm the first one to say, look, free markets aren't perfect. Free markets sometimes deliver really fucked up shit. It's just the way it is. But with the blind faith, that needs to be undermined.
There's a very short argument. The larger the country, the larger the politician.
Not necessarily, it depends. It is true definitely with the European Union. Not necessarily true in general, because as we can see, bigger countries tend to have very serious troubles in keeping them.
I simplified, but the bigger the structure, of course, like having a country doesn't mean that you have this.
Oh yeah. Now I understand what you're saying, and you're right. The EU has the biggest bureaucracy in the world. By the way, that's a fact. The People's Republic of China has fewer employees in the bureaucracy than the European Union.
No,
Yes.
that's a really.
Yeah, look it up. I'm not joking. Yes, the biggest bureaucracy in the world. Fewer bureaucrats. The People's Republic of China has fewer bureaucrats, not by much, like 1,000 fewer or something like that, but fewer bureaucrats than the European Union.
But that's for 1 billion people.
For 1.4 to be more precise, yes.
And EU, how big is the EU?
560 million, 570, something to that effect.
So
Less than half the amount of people and about the same level.
and
of
still we have
even
local
more.
governments.
Yeah.
Like on top of that.
But you can say that
Well, China has local governments.
Under that.
their system works
Yeah,
better
yeah, yeah.
because they can shoot people.
Sorry?
Their system works more efficiently because they can shoot people.
In China. Yeah, they can shoot people, although they haven't done so lately.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Not to the extent that they used to.
They're quite nice.
Maybe the new Google filtering works better.
Yes, yes.
The whole social credit system, yeah, that's kind of scary stuff. It really is. It's not something that I would like to live under. I've even thought about that. If that becomes mandatory in Europe, suddenly my recent efforts to learn Arabic might become very, very useful, because I'm fucking off. I'm moving to an Arab country. And sadly, and this again, I don't think it will ever change, or if it will, we're going to be very old, all of us, by the time it will change, if it will ever change. Politicians only run a portion of a country. Most of the country is run by the civil service, the bureaucrats. And sadly, those bureaucrats are never on the side of liberty. Now, we will see, and we'll have some answer to that question in 4 years.
Yes, ministers.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, the yes ministers. We'll have one answer to that question. We will see. Jair Bolsonaro is now trying to put in liberty-minded people in the bureaucracies. I'm not convinced it will work, but in 4 years or 5 years, we'll be knowing whether whether that's an option or not. If it is,
He's a great fan of the military dictatorship, so that doesn't sound like very liberty-minded.
Well, again, if you are living in Brazil, you would be carrying a Bolsonaro sticker on your car. Trust me. No, yes you will. Yes you would. Yes you would. How many murders have you witnessed?
None, fortunately.
How many people in your building have been killed in the last year?
None.
As in assassinated, not zero. Great, that's fantastic. This is a lovely country. In Brazil, everyone has witnessed at least one murder, usually 2 or 3. And in every apartment building, at least 2 people have been assassinated in the last 12 months. That's kind of fucking terrible.
I think my wife hasn't seen a murder, but I'll ask her.
Yeah, ask her. Ask her. I'm not joking. In the big cities, I mean, 65,000 assassinations a year.
Yeah,
Can you imagine? I mean, I can't.
she didn't live in a big city.
Yeah, but the numbers are pretty much the same even in smaller places. But admittedly, in rural areas, it's slightly better. But still, 65,000 assassinations. Of course, people want someone to try to do some law and order there. Whether he'll succeed or not, I don't know. It's an open question. Maybe he won't. I don't know. What I want to know from Jair Bolsonaro, and I don't know, and I'll be waiting patiently, is whether it works. The option to have the president strong arm his people that are definitely better than the communists put in there over years by the succeeding communist administrations, and whether those people will be able to turn the deep state around. I don't know if that's possible, but I think the Jair Bolsonaro administration will at least try to answer that question. And once I will have the answer to that question, I'll probably be able. But until then, and this is something that I always advise people, do try to get into the bureaucracies. Here's one way to make money out of this. Get yourself into the bureaucracy.
Yeah, but I need to swallow.
It's terrible, yes. You have to swallow a lot of BS.
No. Every time I approach them, I have to swallow my vomit. I can't function in there. I mean, it's.
See, this is why you always win.
It's bad for your mental health.
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
I can't really argue against that.
I first moved to Alaska.
They have bureaucrats in Alaska too.
If it's far enough, at least they struggle to get to me.
Fair enough. Okay, shall we? All right. Thanks a lot for coming, and we'll probably continue some of the chat over some beer. Thank you.